There's a version of the Vikings living in your head right now, and it's almost completely wrong. Horn helmets, endless raiding, men gnawing on giant turkey legs around a fire. Hollywood built that image, and it stuck. But the real story of what Vikings actually put on their plates is stranger, smarter, and honestly more impressive than anything you've seen in a movie. Start with the horn helmet myth, because it sets the tone for everything else. Archaeologists have never found a single Viking-era helmet with horns. Not one, in over 1,000 years of digging across Scandinavia. That image came from 19th century opera costumes, centuries after the Viking Age ended. If that iconic detail is fiction, it's worth asking what else got exaggerated. And when it comes to food, almost everything did. The Vikings weren't wandering barbarians living off whatever they could steal. They were farmers first, raiders second. Most Norse families spent the majority of the year working land, herding animals, and managing food stores for the brutal winters ahead. Raiding was often a seasonal side activity, something men did for a few months when the farm didn't need them. So to understand Viking food, you have to think less like a warrior and more like a farmer trying to survive a place where the sun disappears for months at a time. Grain was the backbone of the diet. Barley, rye, and oats grew in the short Scandinavian summers, and Norse families turned them into flatbread, porridge, and a thick barley gruel that archaeologists have actually found preserved in the stomach contents of bog bodies from the era. This wasn't a delicacy. It was the daily default, eaten by almost everyone, almost every single day. Bread was often dense and gritty, because grinding stones left tiny fragments of rock in the flour, which is part of why archaeologists studying Viking Age skeletons find teeth worn down dramatically faster than you'd expect for people who often died relatively young. Meat existed, but it wasn't the daily feast pop culture suggests. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were raised primarily for milk, wool, and breeding, and only slaughtered for meat when a family could afford to lose that animal's future output, usually in autumn, when there wasn't enough feed to keep every animal alive through winter. That autumn slaughter produced a short burst of fresh meat, which the Norse preserved through smoking, salting, and drying, turning it into something that could last through the cold months. Sausages packed with blood, fat, and grain were common. Nothing was wasted, because in a climate that unforgiving, waste could mean starvation by February. Here's something that surprises most people. Fish, not meat, was likely the single most important source of protein for many Viking communities, especially those along the coast. Herring and cod were caught in massive quantities and preserved through drying in the cold, windy air until they became stockfish, a type of dried fish so durable it could last for years without refrigeration. This wasn't just food, it became one of Scandinavia's earliest major exports, and dried cod from this era is part of the same trade tradition that still exists in Norway today, over 1,000 years later. Dairy played an enormous role too, arguably underrated in popular imagination. Norse families kept cows, goats, and sheep primarily for milk, which they turned into cheese, buttermilk, and a fermented dairy product called skyr, still eaten in Iceland today, direct descendants of Norse settlers who brought the recipe with them over 1,000 years ago. Skyr was thick, tangy, protein-rich, and could be stored for extended periods, making it a smart solution for people who needed calories that wouldn't spoil. Vegetables were more limited than modern diets, but not absent. Cabbage, onions, peas, beans, and root vegetables like turnips grew in the short growing season and got stored through winter in cool, dry cellars. Wild foods supplemented this significantly. Berries, mushrooms, nuts, and wild greens gathered in the brief window when the land actually produced them. Norse communities didn't have the luxury of year-round variety, so preservation technique wasn't a bonus skill, it was survival infrastructure. Drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, and pickling weren't culinary techniques chosen for flavor. They were the only reason anyone made it to spring. And then there's the drink most associated with Vikings, mead, fermented honey and water, which did exist and did get consumed, especially during feasts and rituals. But it wasn't the daily beverage of choice archaeology once assumed. Honey was labor-intensive to gather and relatively rare, which made mead more of an occasional or ceremonial drink rather than something farmers drank with every meal. The actual daily drink for most Norse people was a low-alcohol beer brewed from barley, and in many households, simple buttermilk or whey left over from cheese making. What's remarkable when you put this whole picture together is how little of it resembles the swaggering warrior feast from pop culture, and how much of it resembles careful, resourceful survival engineering. Every food choice the Norse made connects directly to their environment: short growing seasons, harsh winters, and unpredictable access to fresh food. Nothing about their diet was about excess. Almost all of it was about stretching limited resources across a landscape that offered very little room for error. Modern excavations keep reinforcing this picture in surprising ways. Researchers analyzing preserved food remains from Viking-age settlements have found evidence of surprisingly sophisticated food storage systems, pits lined with materials designed to regulate temperature, essentially early root cellars engineered specifically to extend the life of stored vegetables and grain through months of freezing weather. This wasn't guesswork passed down by accident. It was accumulated, practical knowledge refined across generations of people who genuinely could not afford to get it wrong. So the next time you picture a Viking tearing into a giant leg of meat by a roaring fire, replace that image with something closer to the truth: a farmer checking on smoked fish hanging in a cold shed, a family portioning out barley for the week, someone carefully spooning skyr into a wooden bowl on a freezing morning. It's a less cinematic image, but it's a far more human one. Behind every legendary raid and every dramatic saga was an ordinary, exhausting, deeply skilled effort just to make sure everyone survived until the next harvest. And in some quiet way, that daily struggle for food says more about who the Vikings really were than